What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some Mythic Path recommendations by class for Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, as I've recently been covering that game pretty extensively over the past few weeks to take another look at it after it got its final DLC. One request that frequently popped up was for me to make this video, essentially, so I'm sort of capping off all of that coverage with this video in mind, but the reason I saved it for last is because it's actually a little more difficult than it might initially sound as far as videos go. This is because Mythic Paths in terms of your class and role-playing opportunities are hard to nail down to a single thing that trumps everything else. For instance, all of these Mythic Paths have alignments associated with them, and what is best for them mechanically might not necessarily be what you want to do roleplay-wise, or in some cases it might actively conflict with a required alignment that a class has, like say a Paladin. It's also pretty generally hard to recommend the late-game Mythic Paths because most of those are hyper-specific for the same reason. In fact, if you want to get super technical, the Swarm that walks Mythic Path has the most damage potential of really any of these, and that's because its Swarm mechanic infinitely scales, adding damage as long as you can add stacks to your overall Swarm size, which requires a bunch of grinding, but if you want max damage, you could certainly do that. But that also comes at the expense of losing all of your companions. So with that in mind, a few qualifiers for this video. We're going to start out by talking about some very general tips and things to know about picking a Mythic Path in general, such as the alignment I just mentioned. And then once we get over those general guidelines, we're going to go through pretty much all the base classes and talk about what I like to pair them with. And as such, this is not meant to be exhaustive or, include every single build possibility, as there's a ton of really niche stuff inside Mythic Paths that you can actually build around. For instance, there is, I believe it's a rogue archetype off the top of my head, Master of All, which gets a bunch of bonuses to its skills in particular, which pairs extremely well with the Trickster specifically, because the Trickster uses all of its skills to perpetuate its mythic tricks, which is its sort of main mechanic, and that obviously on top of the sneak attack damage, which scales for a rogue as well. And that makes for a pretty fun combo if you want to go do it, at least mechanically, because, roleplay-wise, you might not like the idea of a trickster. So all of that to tell you basically that this list isn't meant to be exhaustive or anything, but just to lay out both the general things you want to think about when picking a Mythic Path on top of some suggestions from me personally and ways I like to play. So with all of that said, let's dive into the very general stuff. Now right away here in this section, I want to point out that with very few exceptions, the Mythic Paths are essentially designed to incorporate basically every class in some way. It might not necessarily be the best idea, but you can generally do it. For instance, if you want to play as a Paladin, nothing is stopping you from picking the Demon Mythic Path. In fact, there's even some decent synergies there, but because of the alignment conflict, you might run into some trouble and either lose your Paladin powers or fail to transform fully into a demon. But outside of cases like that, mechanically speaking, these all typically have something that works in unison with everything. Even so, though, there are some general tips here that are very helpful in general, probably the strongest of which is the merged spellbook for the Lich and Angel Mythic Paths. So in this game, every single class that can cast something has all of what it can cast relegated to what it calls a spellbook. Based on your level in that class and a few outside metrics, that's generally how you're going to get your caster level for that class and its spells that it has access to. Now that's important because usually these are separate, so if I say grab a Sorcerer and then mix it with something else that has a separate spellbook, those are not the same spellbook, even if I'll be able to know all of those spells, and you have to toggle between those in the spellbook menu in order to prepare the appropriate spells and everything. In some cases, these stack with prestige classes, but when it comes to Mythic Paths, the big thing to know is that full Divine and Arcane casters can merge their spellbook with the Angel and Lich respectively, which gives them access to level 10 spells as compared to the usual limit of level 9. This is extremely strong, and essentially means that if you are playing a full Divine or Arcane caster, those are usually your best options. And examples of a full divine caster would be any divine caster that can cast up to level 9 spells normally. This includes things like, say, an oracle or a cleric. And for arcane, these are things like sorcerers or wizards who can cast level 9 spells as well, and they merge very, very well with the lich. Now, the issue here being that those options together actually have alignment restrictions. Liches need to be evil typically, and angels obviously err on the side of good, and that makes that a little more complicated if you're concerned about anything beyond just simple mechanics. So always be on the lookout for any synergy you can set up there because, again, the merged spellbooks are just incredible, honestly. Next up, though, is alignment. I've already covered this a little bit, so to be brief, Mythic paths have alignment restrictions, and while generally that's not a big deal depending on the type of playstyle you want to play and the fact that you do have a little wiggle room, in that sometimes you don't necessarily need to be the alignment of the Mythic path, you just simply need to be not the complete opposite alignment. And stuff like neutral is therefore pretty forgiving. But some classes come with alignment restrictions, Paladin being the most notable because they are specifically relegated to lawful good, whereas other classes, like say Barbarian, are only restricted in the sense that they're not allowed to be lawful, which basically makes Aeon the only thing you want to avoid there. And even then, maybe not necessarily, if you want to roll it into something later. But stuff like the Druid and the Shifter, which has alignment restrictions of neutral, is honestly pretty forgiving because nothing really cares too much if you're neutral. Now, the third thing I want to mention here is what is the Mythic Path's main mechanic and how does it interact with your class mechanics? So as an example, the demon focuses on a rage mechanic, and obviously things that also have a rage mechanic are going to fit in pretty well with this because that typically stacks, such as a barbarian's rage and demon rage. Another good example is the Inquisitor class and their Bane ability, which allows them to deal extra damage against certain types of enemies so many times per day, which effectively, due to the implementation in this game, is just flat extra damage. This actually stacks with the Aeon's Bane ability, which is the same thing but better. Another cool one is that if you are playing a class that gets a mount, you can take the Azada Mythic Path and then have 2 mounts, or animal companions. So always keep in mind how the main mechanic of the path you want to use interacts with the class you want to play. And then last but not least, here we have the late game Mythic paths. These are typically a little hard to recommend mechanically because they often come at great cost in terms of gameplay, with, as I mentioned, the Swarm losing all their companions, Legend trading all of their Mythic Path mechanics for instead being able to take a second class to level 20, which can be incredible mechanically for everything, versus something like the Devil, which on a mechanical level is actually pretty underwhelming, or the Gold Dragon, which has fantastic stats for your character, but not so much for the rest of your party. So there's some things to think about. The main thing I want to draw your attention to right before we actually start on the individual classes, though, is that Legend Mythic Path truly is fantastic for everyone in a mechanical sense, because this means that you can, if your role-playing choices are what you want to do here, take on a Mythic Path that is not concerned about individual mechanics or anything and simply lets you put 20 levels into a secondary class that can then stack or do crazy things when combined together in a sort of gestalt sort of situation. So I'm not going to mention it for every one of these, but Legend works for everyone, more so than any other Mythic Path. But with that out of the way, let's finally start breezing through these, and we are going to be pretty quick because there's a lot of them and I've already talked for a minute. But first up, we have Alchemist. Now, I enjoy 2 things here, and that is Lich and Trickster. Trickster, just because I think it works really thematically with an Alchemist in terms of kind of what they're all about, that sort of crazy, zany sort of thing, but also their focus on their intelligence stat is going to give them a bunch of skill points, which makes them good for the Trickster and kind of having a variety of options via that path, and then the Lich is great for that sort of evil scientist vibe, but also has things like their Lich Dark powers to make the Alchemist more interesting, or even turn their bomb damage into negative energy, which is a really cool way to kind of mix up what that class would normally be about. Now then we have the Arcanist. As a full arcane caster, Lich is a fantastic option here for the merged spellbook. And truth be told, I think a lot of their archetypes and things like Eldritch Font really lean into that angle as well, and typically that's my go-to for the Arcanist. But then we have the Barbarian. Now, Demon's my go-to here simply for the way the rage and everything interacts, but it's important to know that this one has an alignment restriction of non-lawful. which means something like an Aeon is generally a bad idea, with I think Demon being the obvious choice, both for its things like Demonic Charge, which allows you to teleport on top of the Rage, but if you didn't want to pick Demon, you could also go with something like Angel, which gets Sword of Heaven and their Halo, which can apply buffs to your entire party while also strengthening your own weapons, as a sort of secondary option. Next up we have Bard. Now, Bard is not a full arcane caster, but does have some casting available to them, but mostly, Bards are all about buffing or supporting your party in some way, or debuffing enemies in some cases, and as such, what I like to do with them is pick a mythic path that supports that, which in my opinion is Azada or Aeon. They get a lot of abilities focused around doing the exact same thing, such as the Aeon's Enforcing Gaze ability, or the Azada's Life-Bonding Friendship, and songs that it gets naturally. Next up we have the Bloodrager, which is like the Barbarian but better, and as such also pairs really well with Demon, for much the same reasons, frankly, though this one does not have the alignment restriction, so if you wanted to do something besides Demon, that's easier, and pretty much all the same things apply. Anything that gives you good melee coverage like Angel, or honestly even Trickster for the sneak attack damage, but that one would be a little weird. Then we have the Cavalier, our mounted combat class. I think the obvious choice here is Azada, because then you get Ivu, and once she's big enough, she can be your animal companion that you use as a mount. On top of that, Life-Bonding Friendship should stack with the Cavalier's base Tactician ability, which allows them to share even more teamwork feats with their team, and all around I just think that's a really great pairing, because even if you don't want to use Ivu for your mount, you're still going to have two animal companions as a result. Then we have Cleric. Now the obvious synergy here is Angel for the merged spellbook, but due to all the roleplay around a Cleric and what deity they actually serve, Angel may or may not make sense for you. So while Angel is sort of the default choice for the spellbook, if you wanted to do anything else, I would say it would probably be more roleplay focused based on your alignment and your deity, and which mythic path you think lines up with that the best. Next up though is Druid. Now Druid also has an alignment restriction, but the restriction is that they have to be neutral of some sort, and that's actually really forgiving, because you could be lawful neutral for instance, and that's going to be fine for even something like an Aeon. And even demons are fine with chaotic neutral, and even demons are typically fine with neutral evil. So the alignment isn't a huge deal there, but much like a cleric, they are actually also full divine casters, which means they pair fantastically well with an angel despite being a druid, and how that might seem a little bit off initially, that spellbook does work, and as casters typically druids are really great. Now that said, druids can also get an animal companion, which as always I think is really fun to pair with Azada for the double up there. Moving right along though, we then have Fighter. So Fighter is a very versatile class that is obviously quite easy to play, as it isn't necessarily all that complicated, but can fit a variety of roles, especially when you start moving into their different archetypes. As such, there really isn't a best option for the Fighter. It's kind of just whatever you want to do with this class to make it more interesting. You can pair this up with any mythic path, and it's going to be perfectly fine. If you want to go the Lich route, give them some of those abilities that allow them to both be more tanky or add negative energy to some of their melee attacks as an example, or if you want to go Angel and buff their weapon and get their Halo, you're going to be good no matter what. As the Fighter is sort of your default versatile class, there is something about every mythic path you can make work here. But then we have the Hunter. Not the most loved class in the world outside of a couple very specific archetypes, such as Divine Hound or Tandem Executioner, but in both situations I would personally go with Azada for this one, for the double up on the Animal Companion, which in combination with some of their basic abilities can become really interesting. Then we have the Inquisitor. Now, my hands down go-to for this one is always the Aeon Mythic path. This is because the Inquisitor Bane ability stacks with Aeon Bane and picks up all of those new features and abilities that Aeon Bane gets, and Bane is such a fantastic thing to use as an Inquisitor anyway with their normal class mechanics that stacking that up with the Aeon's version is a really fun way to play these guys. Not the only option, of course, but easily I think the most preferred one. Next up we have Kineticist. Now Kineticist is a little bit tricky just because they play very differently than every other class with their kinetic blasts, and that tends not to play nice with most other, I would say, mythic path abilities that tend to focus on other aspects. But nonetheless, we have a recommendation here, and for me, it's basically anything you can use to buff the rest of your party in some way, which is things like Aeon, Lich, or Azada. Azada is going to get songs and everything that you can buff your party with. Lich still gets spell casting and its other abilities like Dark Rites that will increase the caster level of your entire party. And then Aeon with its Enforcing Gaze can adjust and modify all sorts of things. So while I would say that on a mechanical level, nothing pairs extremely well with the Kineticist specifically, you can focus on the mechanics of the Mythic Paths to make them do something interesting here. But probably worth a mention that Lich in particular gets a Kinetic Blast specific thing that will turn it into negative energy if you want and give negative levels as well, which is a really cool thing you can do that is unique to the Lich Mythic Path. But otherwise, I would focus on what the path can do for your party because the Kineticist really doesn't need much help damage-wise, as they are already very strong. Then we have the Magus, the built-in Gish class, the sword and sorcery class, if you will. Tricky to play in general, and honestly, if you're watching a video like this, the Magus class probably isn't for you just because it's a bit more of a advanced player class to play. With that in mind, however, I like to focus on mythic paths that can enhance what we're doing in some form or fashion. So we're not a full caster, so things like Lich aren't necessarily more helpful than anything else. But personally, what I like to do with Magus is mix them with either Angel or Aeon. Aeon, in particular, is fantastic for both buffing your party and yourself, especially in terms of things like bonuses to your attack roll and stuff, which will make up for the Magus' slightly lower base attack bonus than normal in terms of other martial characters. And then things like the Angel will let them buff up their weapons specifically while they do that, and also grant them a little bit of casting, as the Angel's spells have fantastic buffs that will go a little bit beyond what the Magus spell list is capable of anyway, which can be a pretty fun option as well. But personally, I love taking Aeon for Magus over anything else. But then we have the Monk. Now, the Monk technically has a lawful alignment restriction, but there is one exception to that, and that is the Drunken Master archetype. This is because the Drunken Master, as someone who's clearly imbibing a lot of alcohol, would not normally be able to worship the god of booze, basically, if they kept that lawful alignment restriction in place for that archetype. So there is a slight exception to that one specific archetype. But otherwise, you do need to be lawful, which means things like the Demon Mythic Path, which is going to prefer a more chaotic approach, isn't necessarily going to work all the time. But one very popular option for the Monk is surprisingly the Lich, and this is because of an ability the Lich gets that will boost its melee prowess and make those punches surprisingly more effective, but that also includes spells like Vampiric Blade even. So the Lich is a surprisingly good option for Monk. So there is that. Then we have the Oracle class. Full Divine Caster, best option is generally an Angel, especially if you want to take a more melee-oriented Oracle, as you can pair them with the Angel's Sword of Heaven ability that will buff up their weapon at the same time. Probably one of the easiest ways to get a merged spellbook and also play a more melee-oriented martial class at the exact same moment, so really just Angel all the way for Oracle, in my opinion. But then we have the Paladin. Now this is a little bit tricky because of their lawful good requirement. This is tricky specifically because it makes essentially anything beside Angel hard to pull off. Even Aeon typically goes for lawful neutral, and Paladins cannot be lawful neutral, they need to be lawful good. So it's possible, but it's hard. So really, when it comes to Paladin, your best option is Angel, and Aeon is a secondary option, but I'd be very careful with it. And that's mostly due to the alignment requirement the class has. But then, Ranger. Ranger's another class that honestly isn't too bad with essentially any mythic path, but I personally do really enjoy Azada here, specifically because the Ranger gets an animal companion generally, and pairing that with Ivu is always fun, especially if you go with something like the new Sable Company Marine, which will give you both a Hippogriff and Ivu to mess around with at that point, which I think is just a really neat way to play the game. But thanks to the Ranger's ability to use Favored Enemy, but also buff up their weapon attacks if they want, makes them great for basically any mythic path at all that you want to use, but I personally am pretty partial to Azada there. Then we have Rogue. My go-to for Rogue is pretty much always Trickster. This is because Rogues get sneak attack by default, the Trickster also gets sneak attack, and what's more, if you want to pick something like the Master of All Rogue, which gets a bunch of bonuses to their skills specifically, which pairs exactly with the Trickster Mythic Path's Mythic Tricks, which enhance your skills and makes them do different things, I think Trickster and Rogue is the obvious combo. Moving right along though, and coming up on the end, we have Shaman here. So Shaman is actually also a full divine caster, which makes them amazing for the Angel Mythic Path. I actually made a build surrounding that specifically. They can be really, really good when paired together, to the point that I personally wouldn't even consider much else unless you just don't want to play a good character. So that's my main recommendation there. Then we have the Shifter, the melee-oriented druid without the casting, of course. Now, they also have an alignment restriction of neutral, but again, that's not really impactful, so it doesn't matter too much. So for Shifter in particular, I really like Demon, and this is because Shifters focus on natural attacks, and Demons get things that will buff that up as well, which is the synergy I like to play around with the most. Which is a very similar situation for Skald. So Skald gets Inspired Rage, which is an interesting thing to mess around with because Inspired Rage affects your entire party, and it doesn't fatigue them afterwards. So if you use Inspired Rage and then obviously in tandem with something like Demonic Rage, I think there's a really cool synergy there, even if they don't like directly line up. In particular, I actually made a Demon Dancer Skald build that uses the Demon Mythic Path specifically because Demon Dancer gets an extra natural attack on top of everything else. But if you don't want to use Demon, basically any Mythic Path that also buffs your party, like again Aeon or Azada, etc., is going to work for Skald, but I am a little partial for Demon on that one. Next up we have Slayer. For Slayer, I tend to enjoy either Angel or Trickster. This is because the Slayer gets sneak attack damage, which again will stack with your Trickster sneak attack damage. But in the absence of that, I like to take Angel with this one typically, and that's because of their Sword of Heaven ability specifically that gives all that buff to damage, which combined with something like, say, a Deliverer Slayer, which also gets an ability at level 10 called Divine Anathema, which gives them an extra 2d6 against a enemy with an opposite alignment essentially, or 2 steps away from their own to be more specific, can dish out some really fantastic melee damage with their already high base attack bonus, which is how I enjoy messing around with that one. But then we have the Sorcerer. So a full arcane caster pairs extremely well with the Lich. But given that these characters focus pretty much extensively on casting, if you don't want to go Lich for roleplay reasons, the only other thing I would really consider is anything that's going to buff the party, basically. Third from the bottom, we then have Warpriest. So Warpriest is just an odd class overall. Now I will say its Mantis Zealot archetype that was added recently, I think is probably the best thing in the game to pair specifically with Swarm That Walks from a mechanical standpoint, as the Mantis Zealot already gets its own little swarm that it's in control of, and obviously that pairs really well with something like the Swarm That Walks. But the base class itself is a sort of an odd mix of Cleric and Fighter that's honestly not as good as either one of those two things, which makes them a, let's say, less than popular class most of the time. But generally this is one I go Angel with just because of how kind of awkward the rest of it is. And the Warpriest's Sacred Weapon is interesting to stack with the Sword of Heaven ability at the very least. Which brings us to the Witch, another full arcane caster, so again, Lich is the obvious choice there. And unless you're trying to build around something very specific, it's really the only one I would entertain. But then we have Wizard, our last full arcane caster. Again, fantastic for the Lich, the spellbook stacks, it's incredible. Which makes that mechanically pretty much my go-to there. But that brings us to the end of the class list, and I would say basically just about everything I have to say on this subject, but just as a reminder, Legend pairs well with everything very, very well due to its sort of gestalt mechanic. So even though I didn't mention it much, there's that, but things like the Devil and the Gold Dragon are much tougher to build around just because of how late in the game they pop up and how very specific their mechanics are. But beyond that, more than anything, this list was not exhaustive in any way. This is just sort of some general guidelines to keep in mind as you play through this game, or if you're looking for a good place to start. Something I really like about the Mythic Path system, and that I want to leave this video off on though, is that it is really versatile in ways you might not expect. There are little individual abilities any given Mythic Path might have that you can discover for your own, decide to build around, and then have this really incredibly specific build and playthrough that even if it wasn't necessarily the most mechanically powerful, was was nonetheless very specific and unique to you, and I think that's a really cool thing to be said about this. But that is pretty much going to do it for this video. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. I will say that I'd love to hear about any very specific combos or things you enjoyed down in the comment section below. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.